this particular section, we're going to talk about more of the social and sustainability elements. I'm going to kick the session off, and then we will hand on to the other speakers. So without any more ado, I will now move on to speaking about sort of the social and sustainability elements. Now, Roger touched on some of this earlier. So, we are in a global situation where the environment that we live in has become very badly affected by some of the actions that us as the human race have been taking. So, you're probably all aware that in 2016, the United Nations managed to get the key nations of the world to agree to what is now known as the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And that response is in direct relation to the threat that climate change is making. And we have globally agreed that we want to keep that temperature rise well below 2 degrees. And it is a huge effort, but in fact, if we can reduce and limit that by a further 1.5 degrees Celsius, it will make a big difference to the planet. But it does require all parties to put forward the best efforts in a combined and collaborative way, so that we can actually see progress at a global level. You're probably familiar with the 17 interrelated goals that the United Nations have already put together, and a lot of those are particularly relevant in the smart city space. One or two of the ones where obviously a lot of you will be aware of them, but 7 key highlights jump out. Now, I'm going to put those into slightly more context, and I'm going to talk about the work that we did in Bristol around climate change and that impact. Now, Bristol's vision to become carbon neutral and climate resilient was brought forward from 2050 to 2030. And that meant that we had to do a major rethink about the way we live, work and invest in the city. And we effectively decided that, we would look at the city holistically, we would start to understand the problems, and what we've done is to actually map them onto the relevant United Nations sustainable goals. So life on the land, affordable and clean energy, which I'm going to touch on a little bit more, sustainable cities and communities, and what we've seen is a huge shift in behaviour patterns as a result of the pandemic. So in many ways, what was the epicentre of a city has become quite remote at the moment, as we've all moved back to our local communities, and we're spending more of our working and daily lives back in those communities. So there's a real focus on that element. We need to make sure that our consumption of the resources, and that's everything from what we eat to our energy and the way it's produced, and as a city we wanted to look at that collectively. We needed to make sure that there was proper decent work for the people of the city that would enable the economic growth of the community, but leaving no one behind. Clearly the industrial innovation and the infrastructure element are key to it. A lot of the presentations we've already heard this morning are talking about that infrastructure and that innovation that is critical. And then overarching, of course, the climate action and everybody having a role. Now in Bristol, they've actually set up the One City Climate Strategy. It's coordinated by the city's Environmental and Sustainable Board on behalf of the City Office and the One City Board. So what you're hearing from me here is a theme that in Bristol there is a leadership that takes the lead from the city's business leaders, community leaders, etc. And it's empowered the city to roll their sleeves up and become a part of it. And then effectively that leadership is enabling everybody to contribute in some way. So it was really key that one of the things we understood was setting clear goals for that collaboration. So we picked out, 10 key areas with a clear call to action to the wider community. So there's a really big focus on transport. Every city transport is a big issue, and for Bristol it is very much about how we move from the vehicle transport to more of the carbon neutral, the walking, the bikes, etc. How our buildings are supported, built, run. We've taken some very dramatic decisions in the planning permission for new buildings. You have to have solar panels, for instance, on all new buildings. There's more things we'd like to see, put into a condition of the way buildings are made. But we've also got to look at the retrofitting of our buildings. And some of the building stock in Bristol is very old, so it's not very heat efficient. So we've work to do there. Heat carbonisation, and looking to different forms of heating the city. Bristol is well down the line now and laying out its central heat network, which is feeding substantial numbers of the city centre buildings now, in particular some of the social housing buildings. Then of course there is the electricity and how that is used in the city and how that's managed. Bristol until recently owned its own energy company that was very much focused on the communities and how that worked. Then there was the consumption and waste. Again, Bristol is unusual in that as a city it actually owns its own refuge and rubbish company that deals with the waste, and it's integrated into the wider policy. So the strategy is very much about how can we reduce the amount of waste that we're producing, and what we are producing, how can we reutilise it locally and stop sending it around the world. Business and the economy. Bristol's a fast growing city. In many ways sounds so similar in size and etc. to Jena in Germany that we've just heard about. It's a relatively small city, but it has 2 universities. It has a very high digital skill set. So we need to embrace the fact that what was a lot of manufacturing skill sets need to be retrained now. Our public health and our services and our hospitals and how we enable them. This pandemic has shown us a dramatic shift in the UK, where I understand that the stats are now telling us that nearly 90% of all doctors' appointments have moved to being either via a phone call or a video call or online during this pandemic. And we heard from Dr. Mike Short yesterday that there is a belief that has moved the healthcare digitalisation forward by 5 years as we've made that step change. The natural environment is incredibly important, as Bristol is in a particularly beautiful part of the west of England, and we have a lot of nature that surrounds us, but we're also very cognizant of the fact that the city is encroaching on that nature, so we need to encompass it into our wider strategy. Our food. Well, I can remember attending a presentation last year where for the first time the reality of eating meat and the damage that is doing to our world and our environment staggered me when I discovered that the farming of meat produces as much of the toxic waste as all of our vehicles and our aeroplanes. So in Bristol we're looking at our food chain, what we eat, and how can we encourage the citizens of the city to play their part. And then there's the infrastructure and the interdependencies of all those that underpin everything that we've just talked about. Without that connectivity for all of the examples we've just heard about, the infrastructure is desperately needed to be able to support that data to enable us to make a difference. And I think the key thing about this strategy in Bristol is that it's empowered everybody. Nobody needs to wait for permission to take action. Now, part of me feels like I'm repeating a little bit as something that Roger has talked about, that Teku just talked about. We were involved with the big clout projects, and one of the issues that the Bristol it faces is it's a very diverse city. In many ways, it's incredibly successful, but unfortunately, it also has a lot of people living in deprivation. And in those areas, there are often the houses that are not the most energy efficient, and often the knowledge and understanding of how their electricity supply is used is not understood. So we identified the phantom load. This is the electricity being used by devices that are technically switched off or they're in standby mode, but the huge amount of energy they're actually still using. We also were looking at the peak demands because Bristol is moving to being self-sufficient with its energy. It's one of the few cities in the UK that has its own wind farm. We're looking as to how we reutilise our waste to produce energy, but that does mean we need to manage the flow. So it was important for us to start to understand the approach to how we supported this. So there has been an EU project, an H2020 project called Replicate, where there is a huge amount of work done on the interface with the citizens. And working with that team, we engaged with, I think it was about 115 about 115 homes where we were able to put in tumble dryers, washing machines, dishwashers that were connected to the internet. That data was then transmitted through the Bristol is Open Smart City platform. It entered into the Big Clouty data lake. We started to gather real-time information on that data. It was really important for us, though, that we understood the ethics and the protection of the personal data. There was nothing there that was identifiable, so that those individuals felt that their data was protected. So as you can see, these were the elements that, from the partnership across the UTA and in this Big Clouty project that were used in this particular smart energy project. And we brought in that knowledge from the deprived areas, and we provided them with feedback. So in return, the case study gave them insight into that energy consumption. And the last data that I saw was that on average we were looking at enabling £150 a year saving for each of that homes. Now, for people in particularly in the more deprived areas of the city, that was a huge impact, and it helped us to understand how we could interface with the public. And as we move towards two-way data communications over energy supplies, it was a huge learning curve for us. Now, I've touched on the social and digital inequality that unfortunately has been completely reinforced as a result of this pandemic. And in Bristol, what we're trying to do is to get underneath the causal elements that are actually creating this sort of digital inequality as well. And it is definitely related to age, gender, ethnicity, education, or even the region that they're living in. Bristol is one of the few cities that has the highest diversity, and we actually have more people of colour than we have of Asian living in our city. So we need to understand how we address these communities and become part of the communities and understand them before we can make a difference. So if I was being really harsh and we looked at the economic scenario, on average, a person in Bristol produces a value of about £31,000. But unfortunately, 272,000 of our residents are suffering from income deprivation. So they're being left behind, and they have also ended up, unfortunately, being a cost to the city. So we need to find ways to enable them to get up to speed, to become people who are adding value to their city and their community. So we touched on this earlier, but funding is a huge issue, and never more so than going forward now. So again, under the One City approach in Bristol, they've established a group called the City Funds. Now this is an organisation that is made up of people from across the city, communities and businesses, and it is using this route to attract funding into the city. We have seen investment funds into community related projects effectively changing and growing, particularly some of the big pension houses, etc., where what they're looking is to have long-term investment, but investment that is greener, that is better for society and has the social implications that they like to have alongside the values of them as lenders and investors. But of course there are so many of them, and across any city trying to achieve a step change, there are so many projects that need supporting that it becomes a minefield. So as a city, Bristol has pulled this together. So what they do is they understand from the One City approach the areas and the projects that are most in need of funding, and they match them then to the funders, and those funders then have at least a starting point as to where they start interacting with the city, and then the city is enabling the communities to effectively lift themselves out of their deprivation, to develop the skills that are needed. And right now this particular fund has already secured £10 million to tackle some of the biggest social and environmental property problems that the city actually faces. So I'm going to stop at this point to hand over. I'm just giving you a little bit of a picture of what is happening in Bristol and that particular area.